The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 1, Continued, Cassette 2, Side 1. Both houses claimed, and normally enjoyed, freedom of debate. In many cases, they spoke or wrote their minds vigorously to the ruler. On several occasions, however, he had a too audacious critic jailed. In theory, the powers of Parliament extended to legislation. In practice, most of the statutes passed had been presented as bills by the royal ministers. But the houses often submitted recommendations and grievances, and delayed the voting of funds till some satisfaction was obtained. The only weapon of the Commons was this power of the purse. But as the cost of administration and the wealth of the towns grew, the power of the Commons rose. The monarchy was neither absolute nor constitutional. The king could not openly and directly change a law made by Parliament or enact a new one. But through most of the year he ruled without a Parliament to check him, and issued executive decrees that affected every department of English life. He succeeded to the throne not by election but by pedigree. His person was accounted religiously sacred. Obedience and loyalty to him were inculcated with all the force of religion, custom, law, education, and ceremonious oath. If this might not suffice, the law of treason directed that a captured rebel against the state should be dragged through the streets to the gallows, should have his entrails torn out and burned before his face, and should then be hanged. In 1330, Edward III, 18, took over the government and began one of the most eventful reigns in the history of England. His body was comely, says a contemporary chronicler, and his face was like that of a god. Till venery weakened him, he was every inch a king. He almost ignored domestic politics, being a warrior rather than a statesman. He yielded powers to Parliament amiably so long as it financed his campaigns. Through his long rule he bled France white in the effort to add her to his crown. Yet there was chivalry in him, frequent gallantry, and such treatment of the captured French King John as would have graced King Arthur's court. After building the Round Tower of Windsor with the forced labor of 722 men, he held a round table there with his favorite knights, and he presided over many a chivalric joust. Froissart tells a story, unverified, of how Edward tried to seduce the lovely Countess of Salisbury, was courteously repulsed, and staged a tournament in order to feast his soul on her beauty again. A charming legend tells how the Countess dropped a garter while dancing at court, and how the king snatched it up from the floor and said, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame to him who thinks evil of it. The phrase became the motto of that Order of the Garter which Edward founded toward 1349. Alice Perrers proved less difficult than the Countess. Though married, she yielded herself to the avid monarch, took large grants of land in return, and acquired such influence over him that Parliament registered a protest. Queen Philippa, says her fond pensioner Froissart, bore all this patiently, forgave him, and on her deathbed asked him only to fulfill her pledges to charity, and, "When it shall please God to call you hence, to choose no other sepulchre but to lie by my side." He promised, with tears in his eyes, returned to Alice, and gave her the Queen's jewelry. He waged his wars with energy, courage, and skill. War was then rated the highest and noblest work of kings. Unwarlike rulers were despised, and 3 such in England's history were deposed. If one may venture a slight anachronism, a natural death was a disgrace that no man could survive. Every member of the European nobility was trained to war. He could advance in possessions and power only by proficiency and bravery in arms. The people suffered from the wars, but till this reign had rarely fought in them. Their children lost the memory of the suffering, heard old knightly tales of glory, and crowned with their choicest laurels those of their kings that shed the most alien blood. When Edward proposed to conquer France, few of his counselors dared to advise conciliation. Only when the war had dragged on through a generation and had burdened even the rich with taxes did the national conscience raise a cry for peace. Discontent neared revolution, when Edward's campaigns, passing from victory to failure, threatened the collapse of the nation's economy. Till 1370, Edward had profited in war and diplomacy from the wise and loyal service of Sir John Chandos. When this hero died, his place at the head of the King's Council was taken by Edward's son, the Duke of Lancaster, named John of Gaunt, from the Gaunt, or Ghent, where he had been born. John carelessly turned the government over to political buccaneers who fattened their purses at the public expense. Demands for reform were raised in Parliament, and men of goodwill prayed for the nation's happy recovery through the king's speedy death. Another of his sons, the Black Prince, named probably from the color of his armor, might have brought new vigor to the government, but in 1376 he passed away while the old king lingered on. The good Parliament of that year enacted some reform measures, put 2 malfeasants in jail, ordered Alice Perrers from court, and bound the bishops to excommunicate her if she returned. After the Parliament dispersed, Edward, ignoring its decrees, restored John of Gaunt to power and Alice to the royal bed, and no bishop dared reprove her. At last the obstinate monarch consented to die in 1377. A son of the Black Prince succeeded to the throne as Richard II, a lad of 11 years, amid economic and political chaos and religious revolt. 2. John Wycliffe, 1320 to 1384. What were the conditions that led England in the 14th century to rehearse the Reformation? Probably the morals of the clergy played only a secondary role in the drama. The higher clergy had reconciled itself to celibacy. We hear of a Bishop Bernal who had 5 sons, but presumably he was exceptional. Wycliffe, Langland, Gower, and Chaucer agreed in noting a predilection among monks and friars for good food and bad women. But the Britons would hardly have created a national furor over such deviations, already hallowed by time, or about nuns who came to services with their dogs on leash and their pet birds on their arms, or monks who raced through their incoherent prayers. The humorous English assigned to Satan a special assistant to collect all syllables dropped by graspers, leapers, gallopers, mumblers, foreskippers, and forerunners in such syncopated devotions, and allotted the sinner a year in hell for each ignored or trampled syllable. What gnawed at the purse nerves of laity and government was the expanding and migratory wealth of the English Church. The clergy on several occasions contributed 1/10 of their income to the state, but they insisted that no tax could be laid upon them without the consent of their convocations. Besides being represented in the upper house of Parliament by their bishops and abbots, they gathered, directly or by proctors, in convocations under the archbishops of Canterbury and York, and determined there all matters dealing with religion or the clergy. It was usually from the ranks of the clergy, as the best educated class in England, that the king chose the highest officials of the state. Suits of laymen against clergymen, touching church property, were subject to the king's courts, but the bishops' courts had sole jurisdiction over tonsured offenders. In many towns, the church leased property to tenants and claimed full judicial authority over these tenants, even when they committed crimes. Such conditions were irritating, but the major irritant was the flow of wealth from the English church to the popes, that is, in the 14th century to Avignon, that is, to France. It was estimated that more English money went to the pope than to the state or the king. An anti-clerical party formed at the court. Laws were passed to make ecclesiastical property bear a larger and steadier share in the expenses of government. In 1333, Edward III refused to pay any longer the tribute that King John of England had pledged to the popes in 1213. In 1351, the Statute of Provisors sought to end papal control over the personnel or revenues of English benefices. The first Statute of Praemunire, in 1353, outlawed Englishmen who sued in foreign, or papal, courts on matters claimed by the king to lie under secular jurisdiction. In 1376, the Commons officially complained that papal collectors in England were sending great sums of money to the Pope, and that absentee French cardinals were drawing rich revenues from English sees. The anti-clerical party at the court was led by John of Gaunt, whose protection enabled John Wycliffe to die a natural death. The first of the English reformers was born at Hipswell, near the village of Wycliffe, in North Yorkshire, about 1320. He studied at Oxford, became professor of theology there, and for a year, in 1360, was master of Balliol College. He was ordained to the priesthood, and received from the popes various benefices or livings in parish churches, but continued meanwhile to teach at the university. His literary activity was alarming. He wrote vast scholastic treatises on metaphysics, theology, and logic, 2 volumes of polemics, 4 of sermons, and a medley of short but influential tracts, including the famous Tractatus de Civili Dominio. Most of his compositions were in graceless and impenetrable Latin that should have made them harmless to any but grammarians. But hidden among these obscurities were explosive ideas that almost severed Britain from the Roman Church 155 years before Henry VIII, plunged Bohemia into civil war, and anticipated nearly all the reform ideas of John Hus and Martin Luther. Putting his worst foot forward and surrendering to Augustine's logic and eloquence, Wycliffe built his creed upon that awful doctrine of predestination, which was to remain even to our day the magnet and solvent of Protestant theology. God, wrote Wycliffe, gives his grace to whomever he wishes, and has predestined each individual, an eternity before birth, to be lost or saved through all eternity. Good works do not win salvation, but they indicate that he who does them has received divine grace and is one of the elect. We act according to the disposition that God has allotted to us. To invert Heraclitus, our fate is our character. Only Adam and Eve had free will. By their disobedience, they lost it for themselves and for their posterity. God is sovereign Lord of us all. The allegiance that we owe him is direct, as is the oath of every Englishman to the king, not indirect through allegiance to a subordinate lord, as in feudal France. Hence the relationship of man to God is direct, and requires no intermediary. Any claim of church or priest to be a necessary medium must be repelled. In this sense, all Christians are priests and need no ordination. God holds dominion over all the earth and the contents thereof. A human being can justly hold property only as his obedient vassal. Anyone who is in a state of sin, which constitutes rebellion against the divine sovereign, loses all right of possession, for rightful possession, or dominion, requires a state of grace. Now it is clear from Scripture that Christ intended his apostles, their successors, and their ordained delegates to have no property. Any church or priest that owns property is violating the Lord's commandment, is therefore in a state of sin, and consequently cannot validly administer the sacraments. The reform most needed in church and clergy is their complete renunciation of worldly goods. As if this were not troublesome enough, Wycliffe deduced from his theology a theoretical communism and anarchism. Any person in a state of grace shares with God the ownership of all goods. Ideally, everything should be held by the righteous in common. Private property and government, as some scholastic philosophers had taught, are results of Adam's sin, that is, of human nature, and man's inherited sinfulness. In a society of universal virtue, there would be no individual ownership, no man-made laws of either church or state. Suspecting that the radicals, who were at this time meditating revolt in England, would interpret this literally, Wycliffe explained that his communism was to be understood only in an ideal sense. The powers that be, as Paul had taught, are ordained by God and must be obeyed. This flirtation with revolution was almost precisely repeated by Luther in 1525. The anti-clerical party saw some sense, if not in Wycliffe's communism, at least in his condemnation of ecclesiastical wealth. When Parliament again refused to pay King John's tribute to the Pope in 1366, Wycliffe was engaged as peculiaris regis clericus, a cleric in the service of the king, to prepare a defense of the act. In 1374, Edward III gave him the rectory of Lutterworth, apparently as a retaining fee. In July 1376, Wycliffe was appointed to the royal commission sent to Bruges to discuss with papal agents the continued refusal of England to pay the tribute. When John of Gaunt proposed that the government should confiscate part of the church's property, he invited Wycliffe to defend the proposal in a series of sermons in London. Wycliffe complied in September of 1376, and was thereafter branded by the clerical party as a tool of Gaunt. Bishop Courtenay of London decided to attack Gaunt indirectly by indicting Wycliffe as a heretic. The preacher was summoned to appear before a council of prelates at St. Paul's in February 1377. He came, but accompanied by John of Gaunt with an armed retinue. The soldiers entered into a dispute with some spectators. A fracas ensued, and the bishop thought it discreet to adjourn. Wycliffe returned unhurt to Oxford. Courtenay dispatched to Rome a detailed accusation, quoting 52 passages from Wycliffe's works. In May, Gregory XI issued bulls condemning 18 propositions, mostly from the treatise On Civil Dominion, and ordered Archbishop Sudbury and Bishop Courtenay to inquire whether Wycliffe still held these views. If he did, they were to arrest him and keep him in chains pending further instructions. By this time, Wycliffe had won the support not only of John of Gaunt and Lord Percy of Northumberland, but of a large body of public opinion as well. The Parliament that met in October was strongly anti-clerical. The argument for disendowment of the Church had charms for many members, who reckoned that if the king should seize the wealth now held by English bishops, abbots, and priors, he could maintain with it 15 earls, 1,500 knights, 6,200 squires, and have £20,000 a year left for himself. At this time France was preparing to invade England, and the English treasury was almost empty. How foolish it seemed to let papal agents collect funds from English parishes for a French pope and a college of cardinals overwhelmingly French. The king's advisers asked Wycliffe to prepare an opinion on the question whether the realm of England can legitimately, when the necessity of repelling invasion is imminent, withhold the treasure of the realm that it be not sent to foreign parts, although the Pope demand it under pain of censure and in virtue of obedience to him. Wycliffe answered in a pamphlet that in effect called for the severance of the English Church from the papacy. The Pope, he wrote, cannot demand this treasure except by way of alms. Since all charity begins at home, it would be the work not of charity but of fatuity to direct the alms of the realm abroad when the realm itself is in need of them. Against the contention that the English Church was part of and should obey the universal or Catholic Church, Wycliffe recommended the ecclesiastical independence of England. The realm of England, in the words of Scripture, ought to be one body, and clergy, lords, and commonalty members of that body. This anticipation of Henry VIII seemed so bold that the king's advisers directed Wycliffe to make no further statements on the matter. The Parliament adjourned on November 28th. On December 18th, the embattled bishops published the condemnatory bulls and bade the Chancellor of Oxford to enforce the Pope's order of arrest. The university was then at the height of its intellectual independence. In 1322, it had assumed the right to depose an unsatisfactory chancellor without consulting its formal superior, the Bishop of Lincoln. In 1367, it had thrown off all episcopal control. Half of the faculty supported Wycliffe, at least in his right to express his opinions. The chancellor refused to obey the bishops and denied the authority of any prelate over the university in matters of belief. Meanwhile, he counseled Wycliffe to remain in modest seclusion for a while. But it is a rare reformer who can be silent. In March 1378, Wycliffe appeared before the bishops' assembly at Lambeth to defend his views. As the hearing was about to begin, the archbishop received a letter from the mother of King Richard II deprecating any final condemnation of Wycliffe. And in the midst of the proceedings, a crowd forced its way in from the street and declared that the English people would not tolerate any inquisition in England. Yielding to this combination of government and populace, the bishops deferred decision, and again Wycliffe went home unhurt. Indeed, triumphant. On March 27th, Gregory XI died, and a few months later the papal schism divided and weakened the papacy and the whole authority of the Church. Wycliffe resumed the offensive and issued tract after tract, many in English, extending his heresies and revolt. He is pictured to us in these years as a man hardened by controversy and made Puritan by age. He was no mystic, rather a warrior and an organizer, and perhaps he carried his logic to merciless extremes. His talent for vituperation now disported itself freely. He denounced the friars for preaching poverty and accumulating collective wealth. He thought some monasteries were dens of thieves, nests of serpents, houses of living devils. He challenged the theory that the merits of the saints could be applied to the rescue of souls from purgatory. Christ and the apostles had taught no doctrine of indulgences. Prelates deceive men by feigned indulgences or pardons, and rob them cursedly of their money. Men be great fools that buy these bulls of pardon so dear. If the Pope had the power to snatch souls from purgatory, why did he not in Christian charity take them out at once? With mounting vehemence, Wycliffe alleged that many priests defile wives, maidens, widows, and nuns in every manner of lechery, and demanded that the crimes of the clergy should be punishable by secular courts. He excoriated curates who flattered the rich and despised the poor, who easily forgave the sins of the wealthy, but excommunicated the indigent for unpaid tithes, who hunted and hawked and gambled, and related fake miracles. The prelates of England, he charged, take poor men's livelihood, but they do not oppose oppression. They set more price by the rotten penny than by the precious blood of Christ. They pray only for show, and collect fees for every religious service that they perform. They live in luxury, riding fat horses with harness of silver and gold. They are robbers, malicious foxes, ravishing wolves, gluttons, devils, apes. Here even Luther's language is forecast. Simony reigns in all states of the Church. The simony of the court of Rome does most harm, for it is most common and under most color of holiness, and robs most our land of men and treasure. The scandalous rivalry of the popes in the schism, their bandying of excommunications, their unashamed struggle for power, should move men to believe in popes only so far as these follow Christ. A pope or a priest is a lord, yea, even a king in matters spiritual, but if he assumes earthly possessions or political authority, he is unworthy of his office. Christ had not whereon to rest his head, but men say this pope hath more than half the empire. Christ was meek. The pope sits on his throne and makes lords to kiss his feet. Perhaps, Wycliffe gently suggested, the pope is the Antichrist, predicted in the first epistle of the Apostle John, the beast of the Apocalypse, heralding the second coming of Christ. The solution of the problem, as Wycliffe saw it, lay in separating the Church from all material possessions and power. Christ and his apostles had lived in poverty, so should his priests. The friars and monks should return to the full observance of their rules, avoiding all property or luxury. Priests should with joy suffer temporal lordship to be taken from them. They should content themselves with food and clothing, and live on freely given alms. If the clergy will not disendow themselves by a voluntary return to evangelical poverty, the state should step in and confiscate their goods. Let lords and kings mend them, and constrain priests to hold to the poverty that Christ ordained. Let not the king, in so doing, fear the curses of the pope, for no man's cursing hath any strength but inasmuch as God himself curseth. Kings are responsible to God alone, from whom they derive their dominion. Instead of accepting the doctrine of Gregory VII and Boniface VIII, that secular governments must be subject to the Church, the state, said Wycliffe, should consider itself supreme in all temporal matters, and should take control of all ecclesiastical property. Priests should be ordained by the king. The power of the priest lay in his right to administer the sacraments. Wycliffe turned to these with a full anticipation of Luther and Calvin. He denied the necessity of auricular confession, and advocated a return to the voluntary public confession favored by the early Christians. Privy confession made to priests is not needful, but brought in late by the fiend, for Christ used it not, nor any of his apostles after him. It now makes men thralls to the clergy, and is sometimes abused for economic or political ends. And by this privy shriving, a friar and a nun may sin together. Good laymen may absolve a sinner more effectively than wicked priests, but in truth, only God can absolve. In general, we should doubt the validity of a sacrament administered by a sinful or heretical priest. Nor can a priest, good or bad, change the bread and wine of the Eucharist into the physical body and blood of Christ. Nothing seemed to Wycliffe more abominable than the thought that some of the priests whom he knew could perform such a God-creating miracle. Like Luther, Wycliffe denied transubstantiation, but not the real presence. By a mystery that neither pretended to explain, Christ was made spiritually, truly, really, effectively present, but along with the bread and wine, which did not, as the Church taught, cease to exist. Wycliffe would not admit that these ideas were heretical, but this theory of consubstantiality alarmed some of his supporters. John of Gaunt hurried over to Oxford and urged his friend to say no more about the Eucharist, this in 1381. Wycliffe rejected the advice and reaffirmed his views in a Confessio dated May 10, 1381. A month later, social revolution flared out in England and frightened all property owners into discountenancing any doctrine that threatened any form of property, lay or ecclesiastical. Wycliffe now lost most of his backing in the government, and the assassination of Archbishop Sudbury by the rebels promoted his most resolute enemy, Bishop Courtenay, to the primacy of England. Courtenay felt that if Wycliffe's conception of the Eucharist were allowed to spread, it would undermine the prestige of the clergy, and therefore also the foundation of the Church's moral authority. In May 1382, he summoned a council of clergy to meet at the Blackfriars Convent in London. Having persuaded this assembly to condemn 24 propositions which he read from Wycliffe's works, he sent a peremptory command to the Chancellor of Oxford to restrain the author from any further teaching or preaching until his orthodoxy should be proved. King Richard II, as part of his reaction to the uprising that had almost deposed him, ordered the Chancellor to expel Wycliffe and all his adherents. Wycliffe retired to his living at Lutterworth, apparently still protected by John of Gaunt. Embarrassed by the admiration expressed for him by the priest John Ball, a chief protagonist of the revolt, Wycliffe issued several tracts dissociating himself from the rebels. He disclaimed any socialist views, and urged his followers to submit patiently to their terrestrial lords in the firm hope of recompense after death. Nevertheless, he continued his pamphleteering against the Church and organized a body of poor preaching priests to spread his reformation among the people. Some of these lollards, a word probably from Middle Dutch lollert, from lollen, to mutter, murmur, or mumble, as in prayers, were men of meagre schooling. Some were Oxford dons. All went robed in black wool and barefoot, like the early friars. All were warmed with the ardor of men who had rediscovered Christ. Theirs was already the Protestant emphasis on an infallible Bible as against the fallible traditions and dogmas of the Church, and on the sermon in the vernacular as against a mystic ritual in a foreign tongue. For these lay priests, and for their literate hearers, Wycliffe wrote in rough and vigorous English some 300 sermons and many religious tracts, and since he urged a return to the Christianity of the New Testament, he set himself and his aides to translate the Bible as the sole and unerring guide to true religion. Till that time, 1381, only small portions of Scripture had been rendered into English. A French translation was known to the educated classes, and an Anglo-Saxon version, unintelligible to Wycliffe's England, had come down from King Alfred's time. The Church, finding that heretics like the Waldensians made much use of the Bible, had discouraged the people from reading unauthorized translations, and had deprecated the creedal chaos that she expected when every party should make and color its own translation, and every reader be free to make his own interpretation of the scriptural text. But Wycliffe was resolved that the Bible should be available to any Englishman who could read. He appears to have translated the New Testament himself, leaving the Old Testament to Nicholas Hereford and John Purvey. The whole was finished some 10 years after Wycliffe's death. The translation was made from Jerome's Latin version, not from the Hebrew of the Old Testament or the Greek of the New. It was not a model of English prose, but it was a vital event in English history. In 1384, Pope Urban VI summoned Wycliffe to appear before him in Rome. A different summons exceeded it in authority. On December 28, 1384, the ailing reformer suffered a paralytic stroke as he was attending Mass, and 3 days later he died. He was buried in Lutterworth, but by a decree of the Council of Constance, on May 4, 1415, his bones were dug up and cast into a nearby stream. Search was made for his writings, and as many as were found were destroyed. All the major elements of the Reformation were in Wycliffe: the revolt against the worldliness of the clergy, and the call for a sterner morality, the return from the Church to the Bible, from Aquinas to Augustine, from free will to predestination, from salvation by works to election by divine grace, the rejection of indulgences, auricular confession, and transubstantiation, the deposition of the priest as an intermediary between God and man, the protest against the alienation of national wealth to Rome, the invitation to the state to end its subordination to the papacy, the attack, preparing for Henry VIII, on the temporal possessions of the clergy. If the Great Revolt had not ended the government's protection of Wycliffe's efforts, the Reformation might have taken form and root in England 130 years before it broke out in Germany. 3. The Great Revolt, 1381. England and Wales had, in 1307, a population precariously estimated at 3 million, a slow increase from a supposed 2.5 million in 1066. The figures suggest a sluggish advance of agricultural and industrial techniques, and an effective control of human multiplication by famine, disease, and war, in a fertile but narrow island, never meant to sustain with its own resources any great multitude of men. Probably 3/4 of the people were peasants, and half of these were serfs. In this regard, England lagged a century behind France. Class distinctions were sharper than on the continent. Life seemed to revolve about two foci: gracious or arrogant lordship at one end, hopeful or resentful service at the other. The barons, aside from their limited duties to the king, were masters of all they surveyed, and of much beyond. The Dukes of Lancaster, Norfolk, and Buckingham had estates rivaling those of the crown, and the Nevilles and Percys had hardly less. The feudal lord bound his vassal knights and their squires to serve and defend him and wear his livery. Livery was originally, in Anglo-French, livret, a delivery or allowance of provisions or clothing made by a lord to a vassal. In time, the clothing took on the character of a uniform worn by the clients of a great man in the pomp of his retinue. Guilds adopted the custom and proudly wore their distinctive livery at their meetings and in their parades. Such habits gave color to merry England. Nevertheless, one might rise from class to class. A rich merchant's daughter could catch a noble and a title, and Chaucer, reborn, would have been startled to find his granddaughter a duchess. The middle classes assumed such manners of the aristocracy as they could manage. They began to address one another as master in England, monseigneur in France. Soon every man was a Mr. or Monsieur, and every woman a mistress or madame. Industry progressed faster than agriculture. By 1300, almost all the coal fields of Britain were being worked. Silver, iron, lead, and tin were mined, and the export of metals ranked high in the nation's foreign trade. It was a common remark that the kingdom is of greater value under the land than above. The woolen industry began in this century to make England rich. The lords withdrew more and more lands from the common uses formerly allowed to their serfs and tenants, and turned large tracts into sheep enclosures. More money could be made by selling wool than by tilling the land. The wool merchants were for a time the wealthiest traders in England, able to yield great sums in loans and taxes to Edward III, who ruined them. Tired of seeing raw wool go from England to feed the clothing industry of Flanders, Edward, from 1331 onward, lured Flemish weavers to Britain, and through their instruction established a textile industry there. Then he forbade the export of wool and the import of most foreign cloth. By the end of the 14th century, the manufacture of clothing had replaced the trade in wool as the main source of England's liquid wealth, and had reached a semi-capitalistic stage. The new industry required the close cooperation of many crafts: weaving, fulling, carding, dyeing, finishing. The old craft guilds could not arrange the disciplined collaboration needed for economical production. Enterprising masters, or entrepreneurs, gathered diverse specializations of labor into one organization, which they financed and controlled. However, no such factory system arose here as in Florence and Flanders. Most of the work was still done in small shops by a master, his apprentices, and a few journeymen, or in little rural mills using water power, or in country homes where patient fingers plied the loom when household chores allowed. The craft guilds fought the new system with strikes, but its superior productivity overrode all opposition, and the workers who competed to sell their toil and skill were increasingly at the mercy of men who furnished capital and management. Town proletarians lived from hand to mouth, indifferently clad and housed, in good times well fed, but in bad times not fed at all. All male inhabitants of English cities were subject to conscription of their labor for public works, but rich men could pay for substitutes. Poverty was bitter, though probably less extreme than in the early 19th century. Beggars abounded and organized to protect and govern their profession. Churches, monasteries, and guilds provided a limping charity. Upon this scene, the Black Death burst, as not only a catastrophic visitation, but almost as an economic revolution. The English people lived in a climate more favorable to vegetation than to health. The fields were green the year round, but the population suffered from gout, rheumatism, asthma, sciatica, tuberculosis, dropsy, and diseases of eyes and skin. All classes ate a heavy diet and kept warm with alcoholic drinks. Few men now reach the age of 40, said Richard Rolle about 1340, and fewer still the age of 50. Public sanitation was primitive. The stench of tanneries, pigsties, and latrines sullied the air. Only the well-to-do had running water piped into their homes. The majority fetched it from conduits or wells and could not waste it on weekly baths. The lower classes offered ready victims for the pestilences that periodically decimated the population. In 1349, the bubonic plague crossed from Normandy to England and Wales, and thence a year later into Scotland and Ireland. It returned to England in 1361, 1368, 1375, 1382, 1390, 1438, 1464. All in all, it carried away one Englishman out of every 3. Nearly half the clergy died. Perhaps some of the abuses later complained of in the English Church were due to the necessity of hastily impressing into her service men lacking the proper qualifications of training and character. Art suffered. Ecclesiastical building almost stopped for a generation. Morals suffered. Family ties were loosed, sexual relations overflowed the banks within which the institution of marriage sought to confine them for social order's sake. The laws lacked officers to enforce them, and were frequently ignored. The plague collaborated with war to quicken the decline of the manorial system. Many peasants, having lost their children or their aids, deserted their tenancies for the towns. Landowners were obliged to hire free workers at twice the former wage, to attract new tenants with easier terms than before, and to commute feudal services into money payments. Themselves forced to pay rising prices for everything that they bought, the landlords appealed to the government to stabilize wages. The Royal Council responded, on June 18, 1349, with an ordinance substantially as follows. Because a great part of the people, and especially of workers and servants, late died of the pestilence, and many will not serve unless they receive excessive wages, and some rather willing to beg in idleness than by labor to get their living, we, considering the grievous discommodity which, of the lack especially of ploughmen and such labourers, may hereafter come, have upon deliberation and treaty with the prelates and the nobles, and learned men assisting us, of their mutual counsel ordained, 1. Every person able in body and under the age of 60 years, not having wherewith to live, being required, shall be bound to serve him that doth require him, or else be committed to the jail, until he find surety to serve. 2. If a workman or servant depart from service before the time agreed upon, he shall be imprisoned. 3. The old wages and no more shall be given to servants. 5. If any artificer or workman take more wages than were wont to be paid, he shall be committed to the jail. 6. Victuals shall be sold at reasonable prices. 7. No person shall give anything to a beggar that is able to labor. This ordinance was so widely disregarded by employers and employees that Parliament issued, on February 9, 1351, a statute of labourers specifying that no wages should be paid above the 1346 rate, fixing definite prices for a large number of services and commodities, and establishing enforcement machinery. A further act of 1316 decreed that peasants who left their lands before the term of their contract or tenancy expired might be brought back by force, and at the discretion of the justices of the peace might be branded on the brow. Similar measures, of increasing severity, were enacted between 1377 and 1381. Wages rose despite them, but the strife so engendered between laborers and government inflamed the conflict of classes and lent new weapons to the preachers of revolt. The rebellion that ensued had a dozen sources. Those peasants who were still serfs demanded freedom. Those who were free called for an end to feudal dues still required of them, and tenants urged that the rent of land should be lowered to 4 pence, or about $1.67, per acre per year. Some towns were still subject to feudal overlords and longed for self-government. In the liberated communities, the working men hated the mercantile oligarchy, and journeymen protested against their insecurity and poverty. All alike, peasants, proletarians, even parish priests, denounced the governmental mismanagement of Edward III's last years, of Richard II's earliest. They asked why English arms had so regularly been beaten after 1369, and why such heavy taxes had been raised to finance such defeats. They particularly abominated Archbishop Sudbury and Robert Hales, the chief ministers of the young king, and John of Gaunt as the front and protector of governmental corruption and incompetence. The Lollard preachers had little connection with the movement, but they had shared in preparing minds for the revolt. John Ball, the intellectual of the rebellion, quoted Wycliffe approvingly, and Wat Tyler followed Wycliffe in demanding disendowment of the church. Ball was the mad priest of Kent, as Froissart called him, who taught communism to his congregation and was excommunicated in 1366. He became an itinerant preacher, denouncing the wicked wealth of prelates and lords, calling for a return of the clergy to evangelical poverty, and making fun of the rival popes who, in the schism, were dividing the garments of Christ. Tradition ascribed to him a famous couplet. When Adam delved into Eve's span, who was then the gentleman? That is, when Adam dug in the earth and Eve plied the loom, were there any class divisions in Eden? Froissart, though so fond of the English aristocracy, quoted Ball's alleged views at sympathetic length. My good friends, matters cannot go on well in England until all things shall be in common, when there shall be neither vassals nor lords, when the lords shall be no more masters than ourselves. How ill they behave to us! For what reason do they thus hold us in bondage? Are we not all descended from the same parents, Adam and Eve? And what can they show that they should be more masters than ourselves? We are called slaves, and if we do not perform our service, we are beaten. Let us go to the king and remonstrate with him. He is young, and from him we may obtain a favorable answer, and if not, we must ourselves seek to amend our condition. Ball was thrice arrested, and when the revolt broke out, he was in jail. The poll tax of 1380 capped the discontent. The government was nearing bankruptcy. The pledged jewels of the king were about to be forfeited. The war in France was crying out for new funds. A tax of £100,000, or about $10 million, was laid upon the people to be collected from every inhabitant above the age of 15. All the diverse elements of revolt were united by this fresh imposition. Thousands of persons evaded the collectors, and the total receipts fell far short of the goal. When the government sent new commissioners to ferret out the evaders, the populace gathered in force and defied them. At Brentwood, the royal agents were stoned out of the town in 1381, and like scenes occurred at Fobbing, Corringham, and St. Albans. Mass meetings of protest against the tax were held in London. They sent encouragement to the rural rebels and invited them to march upon the capital to join the insurgents there, and so pressed the king that there should no longer be a serf in England. A group of collectors entering Kent met a riotous repulse. On June 6, 1381, a mob broke open the dungeons at Rochester, freed the prisoners, and plundered the castle. On the following day, the rebels chose as their chief Wat Tyler. Nothing is known of his antecedents. Apparently he was an ex-soldier, for he disciplined the disorderly horde into united action and won its quick obedience to his commands. On June 8th, this swelling multitude, armed with bows and arrows, cudgels, axes, and swords, and receiving recruits from almost every village in Kent, attacked the homes of unpopular landlords, lawyers, and governmental officials. On June 10th, it was welcomed into Canterbury, sacked the palace of the absent Archbishop Sudbury, opened the jail, and plundered the mansions of the rich. All eastern Kent now joined in the revolt. Town after town rose, and local officials ran before the storm. Rich men fled to other parts of England, or concealed themselves in out-of-the-way places, or escaped further damage by making a contribution to the rebel cause. On June 11th, Tyler turned his army toward London. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.